When Clint Eastwood enters the Steve Harvey Show studio, the atmosphere is light. The audience expects charisma, laughter, and perhaps a few anecdotes from behind the scenes in Hollywood. Steve is ready to lead the conversation with his usual humor and heart, but when Clint sits down and focuses on the crucifix Steve wears on his chest, something changes: the tone, the air, the intention. What begins as a friendly interview is about to turn into something deeper. For the next few minutes, Steve Harvey won't be the only one asking questions. He'll be the only one trying to hold back tears. What Clint says will change everything, and it starts with an unexpected phrase: "Can I tell you something I've never revealed in public?" Oh, and before you start, let us know where you're watching from. We love to see your reactions. The studio lights dimmed slightly as the audience settled in. The anticipation was palpable in the air. The familiar rhythm of Steve Harvey's theme song disappeared as he crossed the stage with his iconic smile, cue cards in hand, eyes full of warmth. Tonight was different from the first second. Steve knew it. The energy felt less like entertainment and more like something sacred about to unfold. With a voice full of admiration, Steve introduced his guest not just as a Hollywood star, but as something rarer, a soul with whom people felt connected without ever having met. The media calls him the kindest man in Hollywood. The internet says he's the last good guy left. I say he's the best example of grace I've ever seen, Steve announced to a chorus of applause. The audience applauded when Clint Eastwood took to the stage in his usual style: dark jeans, black shirt, and a simple blazer. Nothing flashy, just him. Clint nodded briefly, smiled softly and waved his hand, visibly uncomfortable with the overwhelming attention. When he sat down next to Steve, the energy in the room changed again. Less spectacle, more truth. There was no rush, no performance, just presence. Clint spoke calmly, almost as if he was trying not to disturb the peace of the room. He thanked the audience and admitted, half laughing and half shy, that this reception always surprised him. "I'm just a guy who tries to do the best he can," he said. Steve leaned towards him with a smile. "That's exactly what makes you special." They started talking not just about movie roles and Hollywood gossip, but about humanity, kindness, and what it meant to move through the world without armor, even when the world gave you every reason to wear it. Steve mentioned Clint's reputation, videos of him giving up his seat on the subway, helping crew members on set, donating part of his salary to help stuntmen, cameras, and even makeup artists. All true, Clint confirmed, but he didn't see them as big acts. "For me," he said gently, "it's simply what needs to be done." Clint spoke with a quiet wisdom, never dramatic, never arrogant, and the audience paid attention to every word. "Everyone goes through something," he added. "Sometimes the smallest gesture can change someone's day." Steve nodded, deeply moved. There was something humiliating about hearing these words from someone who had reason to distance himself, to hide behind status and fame. Yet there he was, naked, honest, open. The conversation revolved around the contrast of how someone who had been so successful could keep his feet on the ground. "I guess I've always thought that nothing is guaranteed," said Clint. "I've lost a lot, and when you lose people you love, when life shakes you to the marrow, you realize that none of it makes you any better than anyone else." He paused for a moment, his eyes straying from the camera, perhaps to a memory. "I grew up moving around a lot," he continued. "I was born in San Francisco, grew up in rural California. My father left home when I was young. My mother struggled with illness. I lost my partner. I lost a child. And here I am. Every day is a choice. You let the pain harden you, or you let it mold you into someone softer." The words settled like a weight in the room. You could feel people holding their breath, reflecting on their own pain. Steve, visibly moved, touched the small crucifix that hung from his neck. He didn't say anything at first, just let his fingers rest there, silently acknowledging something that only he could feel. "You speak of silence as if it were familiar," said Steve. Clint nodded. "Silence has been my companion for a long time, but in that silence, sometimes I hear things more clearly." Steve leaned back slightly, and his voice softened. "Have you ever heard God in that silence?" For the first time in the interview, Clint paused. Then he looked directly into Steve's eyes. "Yes," he replied. "I believe in something greater." I questioned, Walked away. I felt alone, but even in the deepest darkness, I could feel something, a presence, a peace. Not always strong, not always comforting, but always there. Steve's hand closed around the crucifix. "That's faith," he said softly. "Even if it doesn't have a name, even if it's just something you feel." Clint looked at the cross, and his expression changed. Clint Eastwood leaned forward slightly, almost wobbly, as if he was about to take a step into the void. "Steve," he said, his voice lower now, full of something different, something deeper. "Can I tell you something I've never said out loud before?" Steve didn't speak, he just nodded. Clint Eastwood took a deep breath, a long, intentional sigh. "One night," he began, "a few years ago, I was in a very dark place. I couldn't move, I couldn't eat, I couldn't sleep. I wasn't sure if I wanted to stay alive. Everything felt empty to me." The audience was absolutely silent. I was browsing on my cell phone to distract myself, to feel something, and I found a video. It was you talking about purpose, about faith, about how God doesn't waste pain. Steve remained motionless, but it wasn't just what Clint said, but how he said it. "It sounded like you had lived it," Clint added, "and you were wearing this crucifix, this exact one. And I remember thinking, this man believes in something greater. Maybe I can too." Clint slowly lowered his head, tightening his fingers around the crucifix he wore around his neck. "I watched that clip 3 times, he whispered. "And the next morning, for the first time in weeks, I got out of bed." He leaned back slowly, almost as if the memory itself had weight. "I never told anyone," he said, "but I've carried your words with me ever since." Steve didn't speak for a long moment, and when he did, his voice wavered. "I spoke from the heart," he said. "I had no idea." Clint interrupted him gently. "Exactly. You didn't need to know. That's what made it real. You weren't trying to inspire me. You were just you, and that saved me." There was emotion in Steve's eyes now, and the light from the studio reflected on a tear running down his cheek. "And that crucifix you wear," said Clint, his voice now full of reverence, "it's not just a symbol. It's a sign, a message. You think you're just a comedian with faith, but Steve, I believe you're something more." Steve looked at him, confused but open. "I believe you're a minister in disguise," said Clint, "and I have something else to tell you, something that could change your life like you changed mine." The studio fell silent. Even the cameras seemed to pause. Steve, still with the crucifix around his neck, whispered one word, "I'm listening." On stage, there was a silence that no longer seemed televised, nor a pause between laughs, nor a dramatic rhythm. It was something deeper, the kind of silence that only appears when the truth enters the room. Clint Eastwood had just leaned over Steve Harvey, eyes sincere, voice soft but firm. "Can I tell you something I've never revealed in public?" he had asked. Steve, surprised but firm, gave in. Now Clint leaned back in his chair, adjusting himself slightly, like someone about to open a door that had been closed for a long time. The audience was completely still. No murmurs, no restlessness, just pure human attention. Clint breathed slowly. His eyes didn't stray. They remained fixed on Steve. But what he saw was very far away. "There was a time in my life," he began, "when I couldn't find a reason to wake up." Steve didn't move, but his body remained motionless, as if his soul had leaned forward. "I've lost people," Clint continued, "not just through death, but through life, through time, through pain, one after the other." His voice was low, but each word seemed to resonate in the walls of something buried. "My daughter was stillborn," he said softly, "and a few weeks later I lost Jennifer. She was the closest thing to a home I had." He paused and looked down at his hands for a moment. "I don't think I cried immediately. The pain isn't always strong. Sometimes it's so silent that you forget you're alive." The audience held its breath, some leaning forward, others reclining on themselves. "I kept working," he said. "I kept doing interviews. I kept playing roles, because it's easier to disappear behind a character than to be yourself when you yourself are broken." Steve's fingers found the crucifix around his neck again, not to show it, just by instinct, just to anchor himself. "But in the end," continued Clint, "the noise outside couldn't drown out the silence inside, and one night, that silence almost won." Steve tilted his head, his eyes searching Clint's face for what was to come. "It was late," said Clint. "I was alone. I hadn't slept for days. I didn't want to eat. I didn't want to talk. I didn't want to be. So I sat in the dark, just sitting for hours. A long pause, no sentences, no thoughts. Just the thought after all thoughts. That kind of emptiness." Then something in Clint's tone changed slightly, and that's when it happened. I picked up my cell phone, just scrolling, not looking for anything, just trying not to feel. He breathed slowly. "And I saw a clip. It was you." Steve blinked, visibly surprised. "You were on stage," said Clint, "talking about storms, about how God doesn't waste pain, about how sometimes what's knocking you down is actually opening you up." Steve nodded slowly, remembering the moment. "I don't know why I stopped scrolling," Clint admitted, "but I watched the whole clip, and then I watched it again." His voice wavered slightly. "You said, if you're still breathing, it means God isn't finished with you yet." And for some reason, that phrase touched a different fiber. I felt that at last, someone had seen me. Not the actor, not the man in the headlines, but the man in the darkness. Steve sighed softly, his hand resting on the crucifix. Clint leaned forward, his elbows resting on his knees, his voice almost a whisper. "And I need you to know, Steve, that night I stood up, not because I was cured, not because I suddenly had answers, but because, for the first time in a long time, I felt seen, and that was enough to move me." The words hit Steve right in the chest. He didn't hide it. His eyes were moist, his lips tight, quivering slightly. Clint Eastwood looked at him with a mixture of gratitude and reverence. "I never intended to tell this story," he said, "but sitting here, looking at you, I realized I had to." Steve's voice sounded slow, charged with emotion. "Man, I don't even know what to say." "You don't have to say anything," Clint replied. "I've been saying that for years." He pointed to Steve's chest. "And that crucifix you're wearing, that's what first caught my eye. Before your words, before your message. That symbol, at that moment, was a beacon." Steve's gaze returned to the cross, his hand clenching it instinctively. "I kept seeing his message over the next few days," said Clint. "Not because it healed me, but because it reminded me that healing doesn't require answers, only hope." The audience remained silent, some now visibly moved, others wiping their eyes, others simply sitting, absorbed. Steve leaned back, swallowing. "You think all you do is talk, all you do is entertain, all you do is survive. But that night, you were doing more than that. You were lifting someone who didn't have the strength to stand up." Steve closed his eyes for a second, absorbing. "I needed to tell you that," Clint continued, "because the world knows you as a presenter, a comedian, a motivator. But I don't think that's the whole truth." Steve looked at him, still surprised. "I think," said Clint slowly, "that you're a minister in disguise." A long silence followed. Steve's eyes filled with tears again. He shook his head gently, not in denial but in disbelief, a humble disbelief. "Have you ever wondered why people are attracted to you?" asked Clint. "All the time," admitted Steve. Clint smiled gently. "It's because they don't just hear your voice, they feel your spirit. You carry something sacred, man." Steve let out a short, shaky laugh. "I just try to get on with it like everyone else. That's what makes it real," said Clint. "You don't try to be anything other than who you are, and that's why you reach people you'll never meet." He looked at the audience now, at the people in rooms like this, at the people on the other side of a screen, at the people sitting in silence as I was then. He turned to Steve. "And I know that sometimes it's hard to carry that weight, not knowing if what you do really matters." Steve nodded slowly, visibly affected. "But I'm here to tell you," said Clint, "that it does matter." And just when the moment seemed to reach its emotional peak, Clint's expression changed slightly, but unmistakably, more seriously, more intentionally. He leaned towards him, lowering his voice. "Steve, the way you carry that crucifix, it's not just a symbol, it's a sign, a message. And tonight I have something to tell you, something that could change your life, like you changed mine." Steve looked up, surprised by the change. The audience also leaned in, noticing. "What do you mean?" asked Steve softly. Clint's eyes didn't blink. "I've saved those words for years," he said. "They came from you, and tonight I need to give them back." Steve remained still, breathing irregularly. Clint nodded once. "Because I believe you've forgotten the power they hold." The weight of the moment hung in the air. Steve Harvey remained motionless, his eyes fixed on Clint Eastwood, who had just leaned in with a calm, firm voice and said, "Tonight, I need to give those words back to you, because I believe you may have forgotten the power they have." The studio fell silent. Even the background hum of the cameras seemed to have disappeared. Clint sat up straighter, taking a deep breath, as if he was about to revisit a sacred memory. "I remember the lighting in the video," he began. "It wasn't perfect. It was a bit grainy. You were on stage, holding a microphone in one hand, the other resting on your chest, on that crucifix." Steve nodded slowly, feeling the emotions building up inside him. "He talked about purpose," Clint continued, "but not in a polished or rehearsed way. It was as if you were struggling with your own story as you shared it. He said that pain has a language, that when someone who has been through something speaks it, it cuts through the noise." He paused and looked into Steve's eyes. "And then you said something that stuck with me. God doesn't always call the qualified, but he qualifies the called." Steve pursed his lips and brought his hand to his chest again, to the same crucifix that Clint had described. "You said that God uses ordinary people to do extraordinary things," Clint added. "Even if you think you're just telling jokes, paying bills, trying to survive until tomorrow, God could be using that to change someone's life." Steve leaned forward, elbows resting on his knees, now remembering that old clip he had recorded years ago after a concert, when he was in a difficult moment and decided to speak from the heart without a script. "That day, I realized something," said Clint. "It wasn't just your words, it was the way you said them. You believed them, and that belief ignited something in me." He lowered his gaze for a second, and his voice softened. "I had lost my references. The pain, the silence, had buried my compass. But when I heard those words and saw the way you carried them, it reminded me that even at my lowest moment, I wasn't invisible." He looked at Steve again. "You were a stranger to me, but in that moment, you became a beacon." Steve let out a long sigh, the kind that comes out of the chest and carries years of weight. Clint Eastwood smiled softly. "And that's how it is with lighthouses," he said. "They don't always know who's looking. They just keep shining." There was a long pause, not uncomfortable, just full of what had been said and what hadn't yet been said. Then Steve spoke, his voice lower than before. "You know, sometimes I wonder if I've done enough," he admitted. "If all this humor, presentation, conversation really means anything." Clint leaned in slightly. "It does," he said. "I'm living proof." Steve shook his head, overwhelmed. "I was just trying to survive, man. I wasn't trying to save anyone. And that's exactly why you did it," said Clint. The audience stirred, small sounds of emotion breaking the silence. Some people wiped their eyes, others simply sat in reverent silence. Steve looked at the audience and then at Clint. "You said something changed in you when you saw that video," he said. Clint thought for a moment and then replied, "Hope. I realized that maybe silence wasn't the end of my story. Maybe, just maybe, God still had something to do for me." He looked directly at Steve again. "And seeing that crucifix on your chest while you were talking about divine purpose wasn't just a coincidence. It was a confirmation, a silent reminder that light finds a way even through a screen." Steve nodded slowly, visibly moved. "You reminded me," Clint added, "that I hadn't been forgotten, that my story wasn't over." He paused again, letting the moment breathe. "I remember exactly what you said, Steve, word for word. I've carried it with me for years, and tonight I need to repeat it to you because maybe you've forgotten how powerful it is." Steve looked at him, a question in his eyes. Clint took a deep breath, his gaze steady. "Sometimes you're not the one who gets rescued. You're the one who gets rescued, and you don't even realize it." Steve curved his lips slightly. "You think you're just talking, but you're actually a witness." Clint leaned back slightly, letting the moment settle in. Steve covered his face with his hands for a second, and then looked up, his eyes shining. "Did you remember all this?" he asked. "I had to remember," said Clint simply, "because I wasn't just listening to you. I was being uplifted by you." Steve leaned back in his chair, his hands now intertwined, as if trying to steady himself. The room seemed to have changed again, more than a stage, more than a concert. It seemed that the healing was taking place there, under the lights. Clint's voice sounded for the last time, softer than before. And maybe you don't hear this enough, but Steve, you matter. Not because of what you do, but because of who you are. You brought faith to places where people no longer had it, including me. Steve couldn't answer immediately, his chest rising and falling with slow, emotional breaths. The moment was silent until Clint added, almost in a whisper, "And today, I have something to tell you that could change your life, just as you changed mine." Steve looked up, and the whole studio held its breath for a long moment. Steve Harvey didn't say anything, he just stood there, absorbing everything Clint had shared, the gratitude, the testimony, the truth. Then, slowly, Clint leaned forward again, this time with a different presence, as if what he was about to say came not from memory, but from something sacred. "I remember every word of that message," he said, "and I want to repeat them now, not just as a reminder, but as a mirror." Steve's eyes fixed on his, motionless. Then, quietly and reverently, Clint began to recite, "God doesn't always use the powerful or the perfect. Sometimes he chooses the broken, the ones no one expects, because they know how to reach people. The strong can't." Steve blinked slowly, the words washing over him like a tide. He had forgotten how to stand firm in the face of them. You don't need a pulpit to preach. You don't need a cassock to be called. You don't need a church to carry the word. Clint's voice didn't waver. He was no longer quoting a clip. He was conveying a message. Sometimes your pain is your ministry, and sometimes your humor is just the disguise God uses to send people hope. Steve's lips parted, but no sound came out. He was completely undone. Then Clint looked at him sweetly, like someone making a revelation rather than a compliment. "You thought you just made people laugh," he said. "But you did more than that. You reached hearts. You saved lives. You brought light." He let these words settle before adding the sentence that would break Steve's composure. "You're a minister, Steve. The difference is that you wear a suit instead of a cassock." Steve lowered his head, brought one hand to his face and the other clutched the crucifix he wore on his chest. The tears now flowed freely, without shame, without restraint. The audience didn't move. There was no applause, just silence, a still, sacred silence. And then Clint said something else, soft, almost fragile. "The way you carry that crucifix is not just a symbol, Steve. It's a sign, and tonight I believe it points to something bigger than both of us." Steve looked up, tears still falling. Clint Eastwood inhaled deeply, as if steadying himself for what was to come. "Because tonight, I have something to tell you, something that could change your life." Steve's expression changed, equal parts fear and admiration. Clint leaned forward, his voice low but certain. "God uses his chosen ones," he began, "even when they think they're just telling jokes." Steve blinked, motionless. Clint continued, "You thought you were just entertaining, that you were just trying to cheer people up. But Steve, you were saving lives." A single tear ran down Steve's cheek again, this time different, carrying understanding. Clint nodded, confirming with a look that said, "This is real. You saved mine." And for a moment, no one in the room breathed, not even the cameras, which seemed to lower their heads. Steve leaned back, a sound escaping his lips, part laugh, part sob, part disbelief. "I was just trying to survive, man," he said. "Trying to get over my pain like everyone else." Clint nodded again. "Exactly. That's what made it sacred." The words remained deep, permanent. Then something happened that nobody expected. Steve stood up, his body trembling, not from weakness, but from something else, something sacred. He didn't speak, just touched the crucifix again and looked at Clint. Clint remained motionless, face to face with Steve Harvey, both of them standing. The studio was frozen in time. Steve had just asked a question that didn't come from doubt, but from a deep and painful admiration. "Why me?" And Clint answered without hesitation. "I'll tell you," he said, unhurriedly, letting the air carry the silence, as if he were inviting heaven itself into the conversation. "Because God chooses the unlikely," said Clint softly. "Those who have been neglected, those who have bled silently behind the curtain. He chooses people who have felt pain because they know how to speak to the pain of others. Steve didn't move, his eyes shining with something older than tears, something sacred. "You're not the tallest," Clint continued. "You're not the most polished. You didn't go to seminary, you didn't memorize the scriptures, but God saw your scars and entrusted you with a microphone anyway." And in the midst of that still silence, Steve whispered, "But why me?" His voice broke into two words. "Why me, Uncle? Of all the people God could have used, why did he choose me?" Clint stood up too, his eyes steady. He said nothing for a moment, then stepped forward, stopping right in front of Steve and replied, "I'll tell you." The camera moved slowly closer. The audience didn't move, no one said a word, because they knew that what Clint was about to say wasn't just for Steve, but for all of them. "Why would you choose me?" asked Steve. Clint stepped forward. "I'll tell you." The crowd remained quiet, some crying silently, others holding their hands. No one picked up their phones, no one wanted to leave that moment. Steve finally let out a soft sigh, his voice shaky but firm. "Sometimes I've thought about giving up," he said. "Getting out of the spotlight, out of everything." Clint nodded, as if he already knew. "Me too," he replied. More than once, the two sat down again, not because the moment had passed, but because it had deepened, changed, settled. Steve leaned forward, his elbows on his knees, and his gaze distant. "I've asked God more than once. 'What do you want from me?' he said. 'Sometimes I feel that I'm not good enough to talk about faith, that I'm not pure enough, coherent enough.'" Clint nodded again, his voice soft and sure. "And that's exactly why he chose you." Steve looked up. "Because your voice doesn't sound like a preacher's," said Clint. "It sounds like someone who's been through it, who knows what it's like to lose, to struggle, to cry in the dark." There was no applause, no music, just presence. Then Steve looked at Clint, his eyes sharpened for something more, something he was looking for. "Do you really believe," he asked, "that we can still have faith in a world like this?" The question hung in the air, heavy, eternal. And the way Clint looked back at Steve, calm, assured, almost glowing with something beyond himself, told everyone present that what was about to be said would not be forgotten. Steve asked, "Do you really believe that we can still have faith in a world like this?" Clint looked at Steve, ready to answer, and what he said next would become one of the most replayed phrases in television history. Steve's question hung in the air like incense. "Do you really believe that we can still have faith in a world like this?" Clint didn't answer immediately. He simply looked at Steve, calm but intense, as if the words needed to form in his soul before they reached his lips. Then, finally, he spoke. "I believe that faith is the only thing that isn't counterfeit." Steve tilted his head, listening. "In Hollywood, we follow scripts," said Clint. "Everything is written, edited, controlled. We rehearse the pain, fake the joy. But faith," he paused, "has no director. It demands truth. It demands surrender." He leaned in slightly, his voice softer but more powerful. "Faith isn't glamorous. It doesn't win awards. It doesn't get invited to after parties. But it saves people, silently, deeply, forever." Steve nodded slowly, his heart in his throat. "Hollywood teaches you to act," Clint continued. "But faith teaches you to live." A wave went through the auditorium, not a sound, but an energy, a change. "Faith is the only path," said Clint. "That doesn't have spotlights, cameras, applause. It's the only place where you're only with God." Steve couldn't speak. He simply put his hand over his heart and nodded, overwhelmed. "I didn't grow up with religion," Clint admitted, "but I came to believe that faith is real, not because someone preached it to me, but because it found me in the silence. It found me when the lights were off and no one was around." He looked at Steve, his eyes full of something eternal. "And he found me through you." Steve looked at him, trembling. "Not the Hollywood version of you, the real version of you. The broken but still standing version. The man with a crucifix on his chest, who had the courage to talk about life to a stranger through a screen." Clint stood up, and after a moment, Steve stood up with him. They looked at each other for a long moment. Two men, two lives shaped by pain, now united by grace. Then Clint stepped forward and opened his arms. Steve entered without hesitation. They embraced, not as actor and presenter, but as brother and brother. The audience rose slowly, reverently. No one applauded yet. It didn't seem right to interrupt the sacred. Finally, Steve addressed the audience, his voice shaky but full of spirit. "I've had many moments on this stage," he said, "but this is the greatest gift I've ever received." He closed his eyes for a second, then raised his head and with sincerity whispered, "Let's pray." In that studio, in front of millions of viewers, two men with stories of pain became instruments of healing. And for a moment, the world believed again. That was Steve Harvey's inspiring journey and the powerful impact that Clint Eastwood's kindness had on his life. But now I want to know, what did you think of this story? Do you believe that small gestures can really change the world? Leave your opinion in the comments. And if this story has touched you, don't keep it to yourself. Share it with someone you think needs to hear this message. Oh, and don't forget to subscribe to the channel for more stories that show the power of empathy and human resilience. Want to be inspired even more? Click on one of the videos that appear on the screen to see another moving story. See you in the next video.